You wake up already tired before the day has even started. Your mind runs through everything that could go wrong at work, what your boss might say, what a family member might think of you, whether the traffic will make you late again. None of these things have happened yet, but your body already feels the weight of them. You spend hours reacting to people's opinions, to news you can't change, to outcomes you have no real power over. By the end of the day, you're drained. Not because you did so much, but because you carried so much that was never yours to carry. This is the exact problem Marcus Aurelius solved for himself almost 2,000 years ago, while running an empire and burying people he loved. Before we go further, if this channel's approach to Stoicism is helping you think more clearly, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps this channel keep making these lessons, and it puts more of this thinking directly in front of you when you need it. Number 1. What the dichotomy of control actually is. Marcus Aurelius did not invent the idea of the dichotomy of control, but he lived it more completely than almost anyone in recorded history, and he wrote it down for himself, not for an audience, in what we now call meditations. The idea is simple to state and hard to live. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. What is up to us includes our judgments, our intentions, our desires, our aversions, and in short, our own actions. What is not up to us includes our body, our reputation, our possessions, other people, and basically everything that happens outside the walls of our own mind. This is not a minor philosophical detail. It is the entire foundation on which Stoic peace of mind is built, because almost every form of chronic stress comes from confusing these two categories. Epictetus, whose teaching shaped Marcus Aurelius more than any other single source, opened his Enchiridion with this exact distinction, stating plainly that some things are within our power and some are not. Marcus took this teaching, which he received secondhand through the writings of Epictetus, and applied it under conditions that most people will never face. Constant war on the frontier, betrayal by a trusted general, the deaths of multiple children, a body that battled illness for years, and the daily burden of ruling the entire Roman world. He did not have the luxury of a calm, controlled environment to practice philosophy. He had to use it in real time, in the middle of genuine chaos, which is exactly why his version of this idea carries so much weight today. The dichotomy is not about giving up or becoming passive. This is the most common misunderstanding people bring to Stoicism, and it needs to be cleared up directly. Marcus did not sit back and let Rome run itself while he contemplated his inner peace. He led military campaigns, he administered justice, he built policy, he acted constantly. The dichotomy of control is not a reason to stop acting. It is a filter for where you place your emotional investment. You act fully and completely in the world, but you place your sense of peace only in the quality of your own effort and character, never in the result, because the result was never fully yours to guarantee in the first place. Think about what this actually separates in practical terms. You can control the effort you put into a work project, but you cannot control whether your manager appreciates it. You can control how honestly and kindly you treat someone, but you cannot control whether they respect you back. You can control your preparation for a health situation, but you cannot control the biology of your own body once things are already set in motion. Marcus Aurelius drew this line constantly in his private writing, reminding himself again and again that his role was to act with the right intention, and that everything past that point belonged to fate, to other people, or to nature. This distinction matters because our nervous systems do not naturally sort experiences this way. When something threatens us, whether it is a harsh email, an argument, an illness, or a public failure, our mind treats the outcome and our own effort as one single event. We feel like we lost, even in situations where our conduct was excellent and only the external result went badly. Marcus Aurelius trained himself daily to interrupt this fusion, to ask what part of this was truly his responsibility, and to release his grip on the rest, not through denial, but through clear, repeated, honest reasoning about what a human being can and cannot actually own. This is why the dichotomy of control is often called the cornerstone of Stoic practice, rather than just one teaching among many. Every other Stoic idea, from the discipline of desire to the discipline of action to the discipline of assent, builds directly on top of this one distinction. If you do not first separate what is yours from what is not yours, you cannot practice any other part of Stoicism correctly, because you will keep placing your peace of mind in places it was never meant to live. Marcus understood this so clearly that it becomes the quiet architecture underneath nearly every page of Meditations, even when he is not stating it outright. Number 2, why modern stress comes from confusing these two categories. Most of the stress people carry today does not come from real, present danger. It comes from mentally handling things that were never within their control in the first place. You refresh your phone waiting for a reply that is entirely up to someone else's schedule and mood. You replay a conversation from 3 days ago, trying to control how another person interpreted your words, as if you could reach back in time and manage their perception. You worry about a medical result, an economic shift, or a decision your child will eventually make as an adult, treating all of it as though your worry could somehow shape the outcome. Marcus Aurelius would have called this a basic error in judgment, not a personal weakness, but a simple mistake in classification that almost everyone makes without noticing. The stress is not really coming from the event itself. It's coming from a belief that you should have power over something you don't. Epictetus made this point with total clarity. People are disturbed not by the events themselves, but by the opinions they hold about those events. When your flight is delayed, the delay is neutral. It has already happened, it is fixed, and no emotional reaction changes it. The stress you feel is generated entirely by your internal judgment that this delay is a disaster, that it should not be happening, that it is somehow within your right to prevent it. Marcus applied this same logic to enormous, life-altering situations, not just travel delays, because he understood that the mechanism of suffering works identically regardless of the size of the event. Modern life is unusually good at expanding this error. Social media puts thousands of other people's choices, opinions, and judgments directly in front of you every day, creating the illusion that you should be able to manage how strangers perceive you. News cycles put global events in your pocket, creating a false sense that you are responsible for tracking, understanding, and having a correct emotional reaction to problems on the other side of the planet that your actions cannot influence at all. Workplace culture often blurs effort and outcome together, rewarding results instead of conduct, which trains people to feel like failures even when they acted with total integrity and skill. Marcus never experienced these exact technologies, but he lived under a version of the same pressure. An empire full of people watching him, judging him, and expecting outcomes that were often outside his direct control, like the weather during campaign or the loyalty of a general 3 provinces away. This confusion between effort and outcome creates a specific and exhausting cycle. First, you do the work. You prepare, you speak honestly, you show up on time, you treat people fairly. Then the outcome arrives, and it may or may not match what you hoped for. If your sense of self-worth is tied to the outcome rather than the effort, you now feel like a failure regardless of how well you actually performed your part. This teaches your mind, over repeated cycles, that trying is dangerous, because trying leads to feeling like a failure whenever the world does not cooperate. Marcus Aurelius broke this cycle by refusing to let the external world have the final vote on his own self-assessment. His verdict on himself came from his own conduct, not from Rome's applause or Rome's criticism. There's also a subtler version of this confusion that shows up in relationships. People spend enormous energy trying to control how a partner, a parent, or a friend feels about them, as if love and respect are levers you can pull with the right words or the right amount of effort. But another person's feelings, judgments, and reactions belong entirely to that other person. You can be kind, honest, and consistent, which is fully within your control, but you cannot force someone to appreciate that kindness the way you want them to. Marcus wrote often about how to treat difficult people, and his answer was never about changing them. It was always about staying good regardless of what they did, because their behavior belonged to their own mind, not his. Recognizing this pattern is often the first real turning point for someone studying Stoicism seriously. Once you start noticing how much of your daily anxiety is actually anxiety about things fully outside your control, something changes in how you experience your own day. You start to feel a strange kind of relief, not because problems disappear, but because you stop assigning yourself responsibility for outcomes that were never yours to guarantee. Marcus Aurelius describes this shift multiple times in meditations, often in short, blunt lines to himself, reminders that read almost like a man correcting his own thinking in real time, because that is exactly what they were. Number 3, what actually falls inside your control. Once you accept that most of your stress lives in the wrong category, the natural next question is what actually belongs to you. Stoic philosophy answers this with unusual precision. What is fully yours is your judgment about events, your intention behind an action, your desire and aversion, meaning what you choose to want and what you choose to avoid, and your own assent, meaning what you agree to believe is true or false. Everything else, including your body, your money, your reputation, your family's choices, your health outcomes, and the behavior of every other person on earth, falls outside this circle. Marcus Aurelius kept coming back to this short list because it is short on purpose. It gives you a small, manageable territory to actually govern well, instead of an impossibly large territory you were never equipped to control in the first place. This might sound limiting at first, almost like you were being told you control very little. But the opposite is true. This small territory is the only territory where real, lasting power actually exists. You cannot force your body to never age or get sick, but you can fully control how you respond to illness when it arrives. You cannot force people to admire you, but you can fully control whether you act with honesty and courage regardless of their opinion. Marcus Aurelius, despite ruling the most powerful empire on earth, understood that even he did not control the weather, the loyalty of every soldier, or the timing of his own death. What he did control was how he showed up inside all of that uncertainty, and he treated that as the only job that actually mattered. This is where the discipline of desire becomes important, a concept closely tied to the dichotomy of control. Stoics taught that you should direct your desire only toward things within your control, and your aversion only toward things within your control. This sounds strange until you sit with it. If you desire wealth, you have handed a piece of your happiness to markets, employers, and chance. If you desire good health for a loved one, you have handed a piece of your peace to biology and time. But if you desire to act with courage today, or to speak honestly in a hard conversation, that desire is entirely achievable because it depends only on you. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly redirected his own ambitions inward, away from outcomes like victory or praise, and toward internal goals like patience, fairness, and self-control, because those were the only goals that were fully within his reach every single day. The same logic applies to fear. Most fear is really about outcomes, not conduct. Fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, fear of loss, fear of death. Marcus Aurelius did not pretend these things were not real. He faced war, disease, and death directly without illusions. But he trained his aversion to point only at things within his control, like acting with cowardice or dishonesty, rather than at outcomes he could never fully secure. This meant that even in genuinely dangerous situations, he could still act with a clear mind, because his fear was reserved only for failing his own character, not for failing to control the uncontrollable forces of war, politics, or nature. It's worth being concrete about what this list actually includes in ordinary daily life. Your control includes how prepared you are for a meeting, not whether you get the promotion. Your control includes how honestly you communicate in a relationship, not whether the other person changes their behavior in response. Your control includes how consistently you train your body, not the exact number the scale shows on a specific morning. Your control includes how you treat someone who has just insulted you, not whether they apologize afterward. Marcus Aurelius applied this same precise sorting to nearly every situation he described in his private notebook, and the sorting itself became a kind of daily mental exercise that sharpened over years of repetition. The deeper point here is that Stoic control is not about controlling more of the external world. It's about controlling the one thing that was always fully yours, your own inner response. This is a profound shift in where you locate your personal power. Instead of chasing control over people, outcomes, and circumstances that will always partially resist you, you place your full effort into the one domain where success is always actually available, your own judgment and conduct. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, yet his private writing shows a man far more focused on governing his own mind than on governing Rome, because he understood which one was the real, lasting work. Number 4, Marcus Aurelius practicing this under real hardship. It's easy to admire this philosophy in the abstract, but Marcus Aurelius did not have the option of practicing it in comfortable, controlled conditions. He spent much of his reign not in the palace in Rome, but on military campaigns along the Danube frontier, fighting Germanic tribes in cold, difficult terrain far from the comforts of the capital. Meditations itself was largely written in a military camp, at night, during a war, by a man who had every reason to feel overwhelmed, and instead used those very conditions as the material for his philosophical practice. This context changes how you read his words. He was not writing calm, comfortable theory. He was actively applying the dichotomy of control to a body under physical strain and a mind under constant pressure from responsibilities he could not put down. His personal life delivered repeated, brutal tests of this philosophy. Of the children he had with his wife Faustina, several died in childhood, a devastating loss by any standard in any era. He also endured the betrayal of Avidius Cassius, a trusted general who declared himself emperor in a rebellion against him, a genuine crisis that could have destabilized the empire and threatened his life directly. In both cases, grief over his children and the threat of rebellion. Marcus faced situations with real, severe consequences that were entirely outside his control. He could not undo his children's deaths, and he could not force loyalty into the mind of a man who had already chosen betrayal. What he could control was how he responded, with grief that did not collapse into despair, and with a response to rebellion that, according to historical accounts, favored restraint and clemency over pure vengeance once the immediate threat was resolved. His physical health also gave him constant opportunity to practice this philosophy. Ancient sources describe him as someone who dealt with chronic illness for much of his adult life, possibly involving stomach or chest ailments, and he ruled during a period when the Antonine Plague swept through the Roman world, killing enormous numbers of people, likely including members of his own household and army. He could not control disease. He could not control the plague spread through a population connected by roads and trade routes he had built the empire on. He could only control his own conduct while sick, and his own leadership decisions while a plague reshaped the empire around him, which is precisely the kind of situation the dichotomy of control was built to address. Even the act of writing meditations reflects this same discipline. This was never meant for readers. There is no evidence Marcus intended to publish these reflections, which is part of why they feel so honest and unpolished compared to formal philosophy written for an audience. He wrote to himself, correcting his own thinking, reminding himself of principles he already knew but needed to reinforce under pressure. This is itself an example of focusing only on what is within your control. He cannot control whether the empire ran perfectly, whether his generals stayed loyal, or whether disease and war ended quickly. But he could control the quality of his own daily thinking, and he treated that as worth the effort of writing down, night after night, in a military tent far from home. There's a particular kind of credibility that comes from a person practicing a philosophy under conditions that would break most people rather than teaching it from comfort. Marcus Aurelius held the most powerful position in the known world and still lost children, still faced betrayal, still lived with illness, and still fought wars he did not choose. If the dichotomy of control could hold up under that kind of sustained pressure, and by most historical accounts, it did, then it is not a fragile idea meant only for calm afternoons. It is a load-bearing philosophy, tested against real grief, real danger, and real physical suffering, which is exactly why it has survived for almost 2,000 years while so many easier, more comfortable ideas about happiness have faded away. This history matters because it removes the excuse that Stoicism is only for people with easy lives. Marcus Aurelius did not have an easy life by any honest measure. He had power, yes, but power without control over grief, disease, war, or betrayal is not the same as an easy life. His example proves that the dichotomy of control was never a philosophy for avoiding hardship. It was a philosophy for staying clear-headed and functional inside hardship that could not be avoided, which is exactly the kind of hardship most people are actually dealing with in their own lives today, just at a different scale. Number 5, how to actually practice the dichotomy of control daily. Understanding this idea intellectually is very different from using it in the middle of a stressful moment, and Marcus Aurelius knew this gap well, which is why Meditations reads less like a finished philosophy book and more like a daily training log. The first practical step is a simple pause before reacting to anything stressful. Asking yourself directly whether this situation is within your control or outside it. This sounds almost too basic to matter, but the actual practice of asking it, out loud or in your own head, interrupts the automatic fusion between event and emotion that causes most unnecessary suffering. If the answer is that it's outside your control, like someone else's opinion, a delayed flight, or an illness already in progress, the appropriate response is to redirect your energy toward how you handle it, not toward changing what cannot be changed. The second step is separating your judgment from the event itself, which Epictetus described as the real source of disturbance. In practice, this means noticing the difference between what actually happened and the story you immediately attach to it. Someone cancels a meeting. That is the event. Your mind might immediately add a story. They don't respect my time. This is going to ruin my week. This always happens to me. Marcus Aurelius trained himself to catch this second layer and question it directly, asking whether the addition was actually true or whether it was simply an old habit of thought layering unnecessary suffering onto a neutral event. This single habit, repeated over months and years, gradually reduces the intensity of daily stress because you stop manufacturing extra suffering on top of situations that were already difficult enough on their own. A third practical tool Marcus used constantly was what modern readers often call negative visualization, though he never used that term himself. This involves briefly imagining the loss of something you value, not to create anxiety, but to remind yourself in advance that it was never guaranteed to be permanent. He applied this to his own life, his position, his family, and even his own body, reminding himself regularly that death comes for everyone and that impermanence is a basic feature of existence, not a personal tragedy targeting him specifically. This practice, done briefly and without dwelling on it obsessively, builds a kind of quiet resilience because when loss eventually arrives, whether it's a job, a relationship, or your health, part of your mind has already accepted that this outcome always sat outside your permanent control in the first place. A fourth practice is redirecting effort toward your own conduct the moment you notice yourself fixating on an outcome. If you catch yourself anxiously checking whether an email has been read or replaying how a conversation might be judged by someone else, the Stoic move is not to suppress the anxiety through force, but to consciously shift your attention back to a question you can actually answer. Did I act with honesty? Did I prepare properly? did I treat this person fairly? Marcus repeats variations of this redirection throughout meditations, essentially retraining his own attention again and again, because he understood that attention is itself something within your control, even when the object you're worried about is not. A fifth practice, often overlooked, is applying this same dichotomy to how you judge other people. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about difficult colleagues, ungrateful people, and even people who wronged him directly, and his consistent conclusion was that their behavior was a reflection of their own judgment, not something he needed to control or fix in order to remain at peace. You cannot force someone to be honest, grateful, or kind. What you control is whether you continue to act with integrity regardless of how they behave, and whether you choose to let their behavior determine your own emotional state or not. This single shift removes an enormous source of daily frustration, because so much modern stress comes from expecting other people to behave in ways that were never actually within your power to guarantee. The sixth, and perhaps most important practice, is repetition itself. Marcus Aurelius was not writing a one-time realization in meditations. He was writing the same core reminders to himself over and over in slightly different words across what was likely years of entries. This tells you something important. This philosophy is not a single insight you understand once and then permanently apply. It is a daily discipline closer to physical training than to a single motivational idea. Just as a soldier drills the same basic movements repeatedly until they become automatic under real pressure, Marcus drilled this same distinction between what is his and what is not again and again, because he knew that under real stress, in a war camp or a political crisis, only well-practiced habits of thought actually hold up. Number 6, the lasting peace this creates. When you genuinely internalize the dichotomy of control, something shifts that goes beyond simply feeling calmer in stressful moments. You begin to experience a kind of durability in your peace of mind that does not depend on your circumstances staying favorable. Most people's peace is conditional. They feel fine as long as work goes well, as long as relationships stay stable, as long as their health holds up. The moment any of those external conditions shift, their entire sense of stability collapses with it. Marcus Aurelius pursued a different kind of peace, one located entirely inside his own judgment and conduct, which meant it could survive contact with war, illness, betrayal, and grief, because none of those things had the power to touch the one place he had actually built his peace. This does not mean you stop caring about outcomes entirely. Marcus Aurelius clearly cared about the health of his empire, the safety of his soldiers, and the well-being of his family. Stoicism does not ask you to become indifferent to life. It asks you to care about outcomes appropriately, meaning you act toward them with full effort, while refusing to let your inner peace depend on securing them. This is a subtle but enormous difference. You can want your business to succeed, want your relationship to thrive, want your health to improve, and pursue all of these goals with genuine energy, while still keeping your actual sense of self-worth anchored only in the honesty and effort of your own conduct along the way. There's also a practical benefit that shows up almost immediately once you start practicing this seriously. Your decision-making improves. When you're not consumed by anxiety over outcomes you cannot control, you think more clearly about the actions you actually can take. Fear and anxiety narrow your attention and often push you towards short-term, reactive choices. Marcus Aurelius, even during a genuine military rebellion against his own rule, is described by historical sources as responding with unusual composure and clemency rather than panic, a response that likely came directly from years of training his mind to separate what was his responsibility, his own judgment and leadership, from what was not, the loyalty or disloyalty of a single ambitious general. This philosophy also changes your relationship with failure in a lasting way. If your self-worth is tied to outcomes, every setback becomes evidence that you are inadequate. If your self-worth is tied to conduct, a setback simply becomes information, Did I act with integrity? Did I try honestly? Did I learn something useful? This reframes failure from a verdict on your character into a normal, expected part of acting in a world that was never fully under your control in the first place. Marcus Aurelius faced outcomes that most people would call outright failures by external standards, wars that dragged on for years, a rebellion within his own ranks, children who did not survive childhood, and he continued functioning, leading, and writing because his internal verdict on himself never depended on those external results going his way. Over time, this creates a quiet, sustainable form of resilience that does not require you to be naturally tough or emotionally unshakable by temperament. It's a trained response, available to anyone willing to repeat the practice consistently, the same way Marcus Aurelius repeated it to himself night after night in a military camp far from comfort. You do not need to control the news cycle, other people's opinions, your body's aging process, or the unpredictable turns of your career to have a stable inner life. You only need to consistently place your effort and your judgment where they actually belong, and release your grip on everything else, not through suppression, but through a clear, repeated understanding of what was genuinely yours to begin with. This is ultimately why Marcus Aurelius's private notebook, never intended for publication, has outlasted nearly every comfortable, feel-good philosophy from his era. It was tested against real war, real grief, real disease, and real betrayal, and it held. The dichotomy of control does not promise you an easy life, and Marcus Aurelius certainly never had one. What it promises is something more durable than ease. The ability to remain clear, steady, and functional regardless of what life brings, because you have finally stopped trying to control the one thing that was never yours and started fully committing to the one thing that always was your own mind.